The first knock sounded like an ordinary visitor, the second felt like unfinished history, but the third carried a promise that had waited more than 20 years to be fulfilled. Rain rolled across the old tin roof of Ethan Walker's farmhouse in Cedar Ridge, Missouri, while the steady rhythm of falling water mixed with the distant rumble of thunder. Ethan tightened the last loose screw on a bucket, catching another leak, before wiping his hands on an old shop towel. Life had taught him that every problem could wait until morning except the ones that threatened the roof over his daughter's head. 8-year-old Lily sat at the kitchen table coloring a picture of their little farmhouse, humming softly as the smell of tomato soup filled the warm room. The house was far from perfect. The wooden floors creaked with every step. The paint had faded beneath years of harsh summers and freezing winters, and the porch leaned just enough to remind Ethan that another repair would soon be added to a list that never seemed to end. Yet to Lily, it was home, and to Ethan, that made it worth every long day of work. Another knock echoed through the house, louder this time. Ethan frowned. Nobody visited during storms unless something was wrong. He opened the front door and froze. A woman stood quietly beneath a black umbrella while rain collected along the edge of her elegant cashmere coat. Behind her, 2 black sport utility vehicles waited with their headlights glowing through the curtain of rain. The drivers remained inside without moving. The woman lowered the umbrella, revealing calm blue eyes and a face that seemed strangely familiar despite Ethan knowing they had never met. She looked at him for several silent seconds before speaking in a voice so gentle that it almost disappeared beneath the rain. Did Samuel Walker live here? Ethan felt his chest tighten. Few people had spoken his father's name in years. He did, Ethan answered carefully. But my father passed away 12 years ago. The woman closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as though she had been preparing for every possible answer, except that one. When she opened them again, disappointment rested quietly behind them, but so did determination. Then I truly am too late, she whispered. Ethan studied her expression. She did not look like someone who had come to sell anything or ask for directions. She looked like someone who had carried a burden across countless miles only to arrive moments after history had already closed its door. Lily appeared beside her father, peeking around his arm with innocent curiosity. Daddy, is she lost? The woman smiled gently at the little girl. Maybe I have been for a very long time. Ethan stepped onto the porch despite the rain. May I ask who you are? She reached into her leather handbag, not for a business card or identification, but for a worn black and white photograph whose edges had softened with age. She handed it to Ethan without saying a word. The picture showed a younger Samuel Walker standing outside an old roadside diner beside a frightened teenage girl wrapped in an oversized winter coat. Samuel was smiling exactly the way Ethan remembered, with quiet kindness instead of pride. The girl looked exhausted, hungry, and uncertain, yet she was holding a paper cup with both hands as though it contained the greatest treasure she had ever received. Ethan looked from the photograph to the woman standing before him. The eyes were older now, stronger, and filled with years of experience, but they were the same eyes. Before Ethan could ask another question, the woman took a slow breath and finally introduced herself. My name is Victoria Sterling. Ethan recognized the name immediately. Even in a town as small as Cedar Ridge, people knew about the billionaire chief executive officer whose company appeared on national news almost every week. The realization only deepened the mystery. What could someone like Victoria Sterling possibly want with a family like his? Victoria looked once more toward the photograph before meeting Ethan's eyes with quiet sincerity. Your father never knew what became of the frightened girl he helped that night, she said. He never asked for anything in return. He simply gave kindness when kindness was all he had to give. I have spent 23 years searching for him because I promised myself that if I ever found the man who changed my life, I would thank him face to face. I cannot keep that promise anymore, but I have come to repay what your father did for me. Ethan stepped aside without another word and held the door open as Victoria quietly entered the farmhouse. The warmth inside immediately softened the chill that had followed her through the rain, carrying the comforting scent of tomato soup, fresh bread, and old pine wood that had absorbed decades of family memories. She paused for a brief moment, not because the house was small, but because it reminded her of a place she had spent years trying to find again. Lily smiled politely before hurrying into the kitchen. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" she asked with the simple kindness only a child could offer. Victoria's eyes glistened as she nodded. "I would love that. Thank you." Ethan placed the faded photograph on the kitchen table and folded his arms. "You said my father changed your life. I need to understand how." Victoria removed her wet coat, carefully draping it over the back of a chair. Despite leading one of the largest medical technology companies in America, she carried herself without arrogance. There was no desire to impress anyone inside the little farmhouse. Only gratitude remained. Lily returned carrying a steaming mug with both hands and placed it carefully in front of Victoria. "It is really good on rainy days," she said proudly. Victoria wrapped her hands around the warm cup and smiled. "Your grandfather once told me that warm food can give people hope before it fills their stomach." Ethan's expression changed almost instantly. That sentence had never appeared in newspapers, interviews, or biographies. Samuel Walker used to repeat those exact words whenever someone in town stopped by needing help. Ethan remembered hearing them countless times while watching his father serve neighbors who could not afford to pay. "How do you know that?" he asked quietly. Victoria looked toward the old photograph. "Because he said those words to me on the coldest night of my life." Silence settled gently across the room. Even the rain outside seemed softer now. Victoria took a slow breath before continuing. 23 years ago, I was 13 years old. I had nowhere safe to go and almost no money. I wandered into a small roadside diner, hoping I could stay warm for a few minutes without being asked to leave. Your father noticed me before anyone else did. Ethan listened without interrupting. Every detail seemed impossible and familiar at the same time. He did not ask why I was there, Victoria continued. He did not ask what mistakes I had made. He only asked one question. He asked if I had eaten that day. Lily looked up from her coloring book. Grandpa sounds nice. Victoria smiled gently. He was one of the kindest people I have ever known. Ethan remained cautious. Many people help strangers. What made my father different? Victoria reached into her handbag once more and carefully removed an old silver spoon whose polished surface had faded with time. The handle carried the engraved name of a roadside diner that no longer existed. When I finished eating, I tried to give this back. Your father told me to keep it until life became better. He said that one day I would look at it and remember that one act of kindness could change everything. Ethan stared at the spoon in disbelief. He remembered seeing an identical set in his childhood kitchen before the diner closed decades earlier. Victoria lowered her voice. I carried this through foster homes, college classrooms, my first apartment, and every boardroom where people called me successful. Every difficult decision I ever faced reminded me of that rainy night and the man who expected nothing in return. Ethan slowly sat down across from her. For the first time since opening the front door, doubt gave way to curiosity. He no longer wondered whether Victoria had truly known his father. Instead, another question quietly settled into his heart. If Samuel Walker had done so much for a frightened girl without ever speaking about it, how many other untold stories had disappeared with him? Victoria held the old silver spoon in both hands as though it were far more valuable than anything locked inside the vaults of her company headquarters. The rain continued tapping gently against the farmhouse windows, while Ethan sat across from her in complete silence, waiting for the story that had somehow become part of his own family history without him ever knowing it. Victoria looked down for a moment before speaking, her voice steady but softened by memories that had never faded. It was late October, she said. The temperature had already dropped below 40 degrees, and I had been walking for hours without knowing where I would sleep that night. She remembered standing outside a small roadside diner on the edge of town, watching families laugh through the windows while the smell of fresh coffee and grilled sandwiches drifted into the cold evening air. She had counted the few dollars in her pocket over and over, knowing they were not enough for a real meal. She had almost walked away when the front door opened and Samuel Walker stepped outside, carrying a box of supplies to his pickup truck. He noticed the frightened teenager immediately, but instead of asking questions that would force her to explain herself, he simply smiled. "Young lady," he said, "you look like someone who could use a warm meal." Victoria admitted that pride nearly made her refuse. She told him she was not looking for charity. Samuel nodded with quiet understanding. "Neither am I," he answered. "I was looking for someone to share supper with because food always tastes better when nobody eats alone." Ethan lowered his eyes. That sounded exactly like his father. Samuel led her inside, ordered a grilled cheese sandwich, a bowl of tomato soup, warm apple pie, and a glass of milk. He spoke to the waitress as though Victoria were an honored guest instead of a stranger who had wandered in from the rain. During dinner, he never asked where she had come from or why she looked frightened. Instead, he talked about ordinary things. He spoke about autumn leaves covering the roads, about how the Cardinals were having another unpredictable baseball season, and about his young son Ethan, who loved building birdhouses in the garage. For the first time in weeks, Victoria forgot to be afraid. When the meal ended, she quietly watched Samuel count the bills in his worn leather wallet before paying the check. She noticed there was very little money left. As they stepped outside, she apologized for costing him so much. Samuel laughed softly and shook his head. "Money comes and goes," he said. "A person who believes tomorrow can still be better is much harder to replace." Then he removed his own heavy flannel jacket and gently placed it over her shoulders, even though the cold wind immediately reached him instead. He walked her to the local bus station, purchased a ticket to a youth assistance center recommended by a trusted church volunteer, and handed her the silver spoon from the diner. Victoria looked confused until Samuel closed her fingers around it. "Keep this until life becomes beautiful again," he told her. "When that day comes, do not look for me. Look for someone else who needs the same chance you were given." Victoria smiled through quiet tears as she finished the memory. "I thought I understood what he meant," she whispered. "But it took me more than 20 years to realize that kindness is never measured by what it costs the person who gives it. It is measured by how many lives continue changing long after the moment has passed." Ethan looked toward the old family photograph hanging above the fireplace and suddenly saw his father through someone else's eyes, realizing that the greatest things Samuel Walker had ever built were not made from wood, but from hope. The farmhouse grew quiet after Victoria finished speaking, as though every word had settled gently into the walls that Samuel Walker himself had once repaired with his own hands. Ethan looked out the rain-covered window without saying anything. For years he had believed he knew every chapter of his father's life. Yet tonight another story had appeared from the darkness, one that Samuel had carried to his grave without ever mentioning it. Lily carefully picked up the old silver spoon and examined the faded engraving with the curiosity only a child could have. "Grandpa really gave this away?" she asked softly. "Victoria smiled. He told me that some things become more valuable after they leave our hands." Ethan slowly nodded, remembering countless evenings when Samuel came home later than expected because he had stopped to help a stranded driver, repair a neighbor's porch, or quietly deliver groceries to someone who had fallen on hard times. Back then, Ethan had assumed those small acts disappeared with the day. He was beginning to understand they had continued traveling through other people's lives long after his father forgot about them. Victoria gently placed the spoon back inside her handbag before reaching for another item she had carried across the country. This time, it was a worn leather notebook with corners softened by age. She laid it on the kitchen table and carefully opened it. Every page contained names, dates, maps, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photographs collected over more than 2 decades. "I started looking for Samuel when I graduated from college," she explained. "At first I thought it would take a few weeks, then a few months. Eventually it became part of my life." She pointed to an old highway map covered with circles and handwritten comments. "The diner closed years before I returned. The owner had passed away. The waitress had moved to Arizona. The church volunteer retired." Every answer led to another question. Ethan slowly turned another page. There were county property records, faded newspaper articles, and even photographs of abandoned buildings that no longer existed. Victoria smiled with quiet embarrassment. My employees think I build my company because I never give up. The truth is that I learned persistence from searching for one kind man who probably never expected to be found. Lily listened carefully. Did you ever think about stopping? Victoria looked at her with gentle honesty. Many times, but every time I wanted to quit, I remembered standing outside that diner, believing nobody cared whether I lived or disappeared. Then I remembered your grandfather opening the door and treating me like I mattered. Once someone gives you that kind of hope, you spend the rest of your life believing impossible things can still happen. Ethan continued reading until one page stopped him completely. It showed an obituary for Samuel Walker. Someone had circled the date in blue ink. Victoria lowered her eyes. That was the hardest day of my search. I found the obituary almost 6 months after the funeral. I sat in my office for hours wondering if I had waited too long. The room fell silent again. Even the storm outside had begun to fade into a light drizzle. Victoria finally looked directly at Ethan. I could not thank your father while he was alive. That regret will always stay with me. But I refused to let gratitude end at a gravestone. I kept searching because I believe kindness leaves behind a family, a legacy, and people who continue carrying the same light. She slowly reached into her briefcase resting beside the chair and removed a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with a blue ribbon. Ethan immediately noticed that his full name had been written across the front in elegant handwriting. Victoria rested the envelope on the table without pushing it toward him. Everything I have told you tonight explains why I came, she said quietly. What is inside this envelope explains what I have been preparing for the last 5 years. It is my way of honoring the man who changed my future. Even though I know nothing I could ever give will equal what your father freely gave to a frightened girl on a cold autumn night. Victoria gently untied the blue ribbon and opened the cream-colored envelope, sliding several documents across the old kitchen table with careful hands. There were property records, financial statements, legal agreements, and a letter prepared by one of the most respected law firms in Missouri. Ethan looked at the papers without touching them. The numbers printed across the pages represented more money than he had earned in many years of honest work. Victoria spoke quietly, never allowing her voice to sound like a business negotiation. The mortgage on this farmhouse has already been approved for full payment. There is also a college education trust for Lily, enough to cover tuition, books, housing, and anything she may need one day. Finally, there is an investment account that will allow you to choose work because you enjoy it instead of because you have to. Lily looked at her father with wide eyes before turning back to Victoria. She did not fully understand the meaning of mortgages or investment accounts, but she understood that the visitor wanted to help. Ethan remained completely still. His eyes rested on the envelope for several long moments before he slowly pushed every document back across the table. Victoria blinked in surprise. You have not even looked at them. Ethan offered a respectful smile. I do not need to. She searched his face, wondering if she had somehow offended him without realizing it. Please understand, she said softly. This is not charity. I owe my entire life to your father. Ethan shook his head. No, you do not. Silence filled the room once again. The only sound came from the old grandfather clock in the corner, marking each passing second with quiet certainty. Victoria looked genuinely confused. If anyone deserves this, it is your family. Ethan folded his weathered hands together on the table. Years of construction work had left them rough and scarred, but they rested peacefully instead of defensively. My father never helped people because he expected someone to repay him later, he said. If he had wanted a reward, he would have asked for one while he was alive. He never did. Victoria lowered her eyes. I know that. Ethan nodded. Then you also know he would tell me the same thing if he were sitting here tonight. He glanced toward the old photograph hanging above the fireplace before continuing. My father believed kindness stopped being kindness the moment it became a transaction. Those words settled heavily inside the room. Victoria had prepared for tears, gratitude, even disbelief, but she had never imagined rejection. For more than 5 years, she had quietly organized every detail of this gift, believing it was the closest she could come to thanking the man who had changed her future. Now she questioned whether she had misunderstood him all along. "Have I made a mistake?" she asked almost in a whisper. Ethan looked at her with kindness instead of judgment. "No, your heart brought you here for the right reason." He gently placed the sealed envelope back into her hands. "But you're trying to finish a story that my father never intended to end this way." Victoria felt an unexpected sadness rise inside her. For the first time in decades, she was no longer the confident chief executive officer who negotiated billion-dollar agreements. She was once again the frightened girl outside the roadside diner, afraid that she had disappointed the one person whose opinion mattered most. She slowly stood, believing perhaps it was time to leave. Before she could pick up her coat, Ethan quietly spoke again. "There's still one way you can truly honor my father." Victoria stopped immediately, her hand resting on the back of the chair. She turned toward Ethan with cautious hope as he met her eyes with the same calm strength that had once lived in Samuel Walker. And in that silent moment, she realized the greatest inheritance Samuel had left behind was not his house, his tools, or his possessions, but the quiet dignity that now lived inside his son. Victoria slowly lowered herself back into the chair, still holding the envelope that moments earlier had seemed like the perfect ending to a promise she had carried for more than 2 decades. The rain had stopped completely, leaving only the quiet sound of water dripping from the porch roof outside the farmhouse. Ethan looked toward the window for a moment before turning back to her with the calm expression that reminded Victoria so much of Samuel. "My father believed kindness was like a candle," Ethan said. "If you use it only to light the place where it began, the world stays dark. But if you carry that light forward, people you will never meet can finally see their own path." Victoria listened without interrupting. Every sentence seemed to answer questions she had been asking herself for years. Ethan continued, "You're trying to repay a debt that never existed. My father did not rescue you because he wanted something returned to our family. He helped you because someone needed help that night. If you really want to honor him, then do for someone else what he once did for you." Victoria looked down at the envelope resting in her hands. For years, she had imagined this meeting ending with gratitude, relief, and closure. Instead, she realized that Samuel had never intended his kindness to circle back toward him. It had always been meant to continue outward. Lily quietly climbed onto the chair beside Victoria and smiled with the innocent wisdom that often surprised adults. "Grandpa wanted people to keep sharing, right?" Victoria smiled through moist eyes. "Yes," she answered softly. "I think that is exactly what he wanted." Ethan nodded. There are families in towns like this all across America. Parents working 2 jobs. Children who need school supplies. Elderly neighbors choosing between medicine and groceries. They may never meet you, and they do not need to know your name. That is where my father would tell you to begin." Victoria slowly closed the envelope. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she no longer felt like someone carrying unfinished business. Instead, she felt like a student finally understanding the lesson her teacher had given decades earlier. She looked around the modest farmhouse once more. Nothing inside reflected wealth. The furniture had been repaired instead of replaced. The curtains had been carefully sewn by hand. Family photographs covered the walls instead of expensive artwork. Yet there was a peace inside the home that many of the grandest houses she had visited had never possessed. "Would you allow me to stay in town for a few days?" Victoria asked quietly. "Not to convince you to accept this gift. I understand your answer now. I would simply like to learn more about the man who changed my life." Ethan smiled for the first time that evening. "I think my father would have liked that." Lily clapped her hands together. "You should come to the Harvest Festival on Saturday. Everybody goes. Mrs. Dawson makes the best apple pie in Missouri." Victoria laughed gently, a genuine laugh that seemed lighter than any she had shared in months. "I would be honored." As the evening drew to a close, Victoria gathered her things, carefully placing the unopened envelope back into her briefcase. Before leaving, she paused beneath the framed photograph of Samuel hanging above the fireplace. She studied his familiar smile for several quiet seconds before whispering words no one else in the room could fully hear. "I finally understand." Just as Ethan reached for the front door, the sound of an old pickup truck rolled slowly into the gravel driveway. Headlights swept across the farmhouse windows before the engine fell silent. Ethan glanced outside and smiled with quiet surprise. "That has to be Harold Benson," he said. "He and my father were best friends for nearly 50 years. A moment later, 3 slow knocks echoed against the front door, and neither Ethan nor Victoria could have guessed that the elderly man waiting outside was carrying the final piece of Samuel Walker's remarkable legacy. Harold Benson stood quietly on the front porch with a weathered wooden box tucked beneath one arm, rainwater still clinging to the brim of his old canvas hat. At 71 years old, his back had begun to bend with age, but his blue eyes remained as steady as they had been when he and Samuel Walker spent countless weekends repairing fences, building barns, and helping neighbors who could never fully repay them. Ethan welcomed him inside without hesitation. Harold removed his hat, glanced toward Victoria with gentle curiosity, then looked at the photograph still resting on the kitchen table. "So," he said with a knowing smile, "she finally found her way home." Victoria slowly stood, surprised that a complete stranger recognized her before introductions had even begun. Harold chuckled softly. "Samuel described you often enough that I would have known those eyes anywhere." Victoria felt emotion rise in her chest. "He talked about me?" Harold nodded. "Not by name. He never believed kindness should become a story about the person giving it. He only said he hoped a frightened young girl somewhere was living a better life." The old man carefully placed the wooden box on the kitchen table. The oak surface carried scratches from decades of use, and a small brass latch held it closed. Harold rested one hand gently on the lid before speaking again. "Samuel asked me to keep this safe. He told me one day someone would come looking for him, and if that person arrived with gratitude instead of pride, I would know the time had finally come." Ethan looked at Harold with surprise. "You never told me about this." Harold smiled kindly. "Because your father told me not to. Some promises are measured in years instead of days." He slowly opened the brass latch. Inside, resting on faded blue velvet, lay a silver pocket watch whose polished surface reflected the warm kitchen light. Ethan immediately recognized it. "Grandpa's watch," Lily whispered, remembering the stories her father had told her before bedtime. Harold nodded. It belonged to Samuel's father before it belonged to him. Victoria stared silently at the watch, her breathing becoming slower as recognition slowly spread across her face. "I have seen this before," she whispered. Harold looked toward her. "You have." He gently lifted the watch and placed it in Victoria's hands. "A week after Samuel helped you, money became tight around here. He quietly sold this watch to the owner of an antique shop because he needed to replace what he had spent helping someone he believed deserved another chance. He never regretted it for 1 minute." Victoria carefully turned the watch over. On the back, she found the familiar engraving Samuel had shown her that rainy evening so many years ago. It read, "Time is never wasted when it is spent lifting another soul." Tears filled her eyes. "After my company became successful, I searched for this watch almost as long as I searched for Samuel," she said softly. "I finally found it at an estate auction 6 years ago. I bought it immediately, but I could not bring myself to keep it. It belonged with his family." Harold smiled. "That is why I have been holding it for you. You asked me to return it only after you found the people Samuel loved most." Ethan accepted the pocket watch with both hands, holding it as though he were shaking his father's hand one last time. The metal still felt surprisingly solid despite the years that had passed. Lily leaned closer and listened as Harold gently wound the old mechanism. A second later, the quiet ticking filled the farmhouse kitchen with a sound that had not been heard inside those walls for more than a decade. No one spoke. The steady rhythm seemed to bridge the distance between past and present, reminding everyone that some acts of kindness never disappear. As the watch continued marking each passing second, Harold looked toward the old wooden box once more and quietly said, "The watch was only the first thing Samuel asked me to protect. There is something else inside that box, and I believe tonight is finally the night it needs to be read." Harold reached into the wooden box with hands that had built houses, planted trees, and buried old friends, Yet they trembled gently as he lifted a single cream-colored envelope tied with a faded piece of blue twine. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting across the front remained clear. It read simply, "For my son, only if someone I once helped finds their way home." Ethan stared at the envelope without moving. He had sorted through every drawer, cabinet, and toolbox after his father's passing, believing there were no more surprises left inside Samuel Walker's life. Harold carefully placed the letter beside the silver pocket watch. "Samuel gave this to me about 6 months before he passed away," Harold said quietly. "He smiled and told me that kindness has a funny way of coming back, but not because it is looking for repayment. It comes back to remind people that hope keeps traveling." Victoria covered her mouth with one hand as tears quietly gathered in her eyes. Ethan untied the blue twine with slow, careful fingers, unfolding the letter as though every crease carried another memory of the father he still missed. The room became completely silent except for the gentle ticking of the restored pocket watch resting on the kitchen table. Samuel's familiar handwriting filled the page. "Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then life has already shown you something beautiful. Someone I once met has remembered a small act of kindness. Before you do anything else, promise me one thing. Do not let anyone repay me." I was already rewarded the moment I watched hope return to another person's eyes. Ethan paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "If that person has become successful, tell them I am proud of them, even if I never knew their name. Tell them the greatest thank you they can ever give me is to notice the next frightened person standing quietly outside a door that feels impossible to open." Victoria closed her eyes. Every sentence sounded exactly like the man she had remembered for 23 years. Ethan continued reading. "Son, there will always be people who believe wealth is measured by what stays in their bank account. I hope you choose a different measure. Count the people who smile because you showed them respect. Count the children who believe in tomorrow because someone believed in them today. Count the strangers who become family because grace arrived before judgment. Those are the only numbers that matter when a life is over." Lily quietly slid her small hand into her father's. Even at 8 years old, she understood that her grandfather had left behind something far greater than possessions. Ethan reached the final lines, his voice almost breaking with emotion. "If the person reading this beside you still wishes to honor my memory, ask them not to build a statue or write my name on a building. Ask them to build opportunities. Build schools, scholarships, apprenticeships, warm meals, safe places, and second chances. Kindness should never end where it began. It should keep walking until someone else believes they matter." Ethan slowly lowered the letter. No one spoke for several long moments. The silence inside the farmhouse did not feel empty. It felt full of gratitude, healing, and quiet dignity. Victoria finally looked toward Ethan with peaceful certainty instead of regret. "I know exactly what I have to do now," she whispered. Harold smiled gently, as though he had been waiting many years to hear those words. Ethan folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope before placing it beside the silver pocket watch. He looked toward the photograph of Samuel above the fireplace and smiled through grateful eyes. For the first time since losing his father, he no longer felt that Samuel's story had ended on the day of his funeral. Instead, he realized it had continued, traveling through people he had never met. And before the night was over, that quiet legacy was about to begin shaping an entirely new future for countless families far beyond the little farmhouse in Cedar Ridge. Nearly 1 year passed before Victoria returned to Cedar Ridge, but this time there were no black sport utility vehicles lined up outside Ethan's farmhouse and no reporters following her every step. She arrived in a simple pickup truck, wearing blue jeans, a light sweater, and the same quiet smile that Lily remembered from the rainy evening when their lives first crossed. Autumn had returned, painting the maple trees in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, while the cool Missouri air carried the familiar scent of fresh hay and apple cider. The town gathered in the community park for the annual Harvest Festival, but this year a newly restored brick building stood beside the old church with a simple wooden sign above its entrance. It read, the Samuel Walker Community Opportunity Center. There were no marble statues, no oversized portraits, and no polished bronze plaques celebrating wealthy donors. Inside the building were classrooms for skilled trades, tutoring rooms for local students, a community kitchen serving warm meals, and a scholarship office helping young people who believed college had always been beyond their reach. Victoria had followed every word Samuel left behind. She had built opportunities instead of monuments. Ethan walked beside Lily as neighbors greeted them with warm smiles. He was still wearing his familiar flannel shirt and worn work boots. He still repaired porches, built cabinets, and fixed roofs across the county. His life looked almost unchanged from the outside, yet something inside him had become lighter. He no longer wondered whether his father's quiet life had mattered. Every grateful family entering the new community center answered that question without speaking a single word. Harold Benson stood near the entrance, proudly watching children carry backpacks filled with new school supplies. He tipped his old hat toward Ethan. "Your father would have liked today," he said softly. Ethan smiled. "I think he already does." Later that afternoon, Victoria invited a small group into the community hall. There were no television cameras and no prepared speeches. She simply gathered the first recipients of the Samuel Walker Scholarship and shared the story of a man who bought a frightened young girl a warm meal without asking for anything in return. She never mentioned the size of her company or the success she had achieved. Instead, she ended with the lesson that had changed her own life. The greatest investment you will ever make is believing another person still has a future. The room fell completely silent. Some people quietly wiped tears from their eyes, while others simply looked toward the old photograph of Samuel displayed near the entrance. After the ceremony, Lily tugged gently on Victoria's hand. "Grandpa would have been proud of you." Victoria knelt beside her and smiled with grateful eyes. "Everything beautiful that happened here started long before I arrived." As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the rolling hills, Ethan unlocked the front door of the farmhouse and welcomed Harold and Victoria inside for supper. The familiar smell of homemade tomato soup filled the kitchen once again, just as it had on the night their extraordinary journey began. The silver pocket watch rested on the table beside Samuel's letter, its steady ticking blending with quiet laughter and easy conversation. Outside, the evening settled peacefully over Cedar Ridge. Inside, 3 generations shared a simple meal beneath the photograph of a man who never considered himself extraordinary. Samuel Walker had never become wealthy. His name never appeared on magazine covers, and he never imagined that one small act of compassion would echo across decades. Yet the frightened girl he once welcomed into a roadside diner had grown into a woman who carried his kindness into countless other lives, and the son he raised with quiet dignity had protected that legacy without ever asking for recognition. In the end, the greatest miracle was never the fortune Victoria earned or the scholarship that bore Samuel's name. It was the simple truth that grace had continued walking from one heart to another until strangers became family. Hope became a tradition, and one ordinary man's quiet kindness became a legacy that time could never erase.